Hi again, everybody. It's your old pal, the History Nerd. I am back in the man cave, and this time I am obviously behind the bar because in this video we are going to taste and review one of the most highly sought and hardest to get allocated bourbons that are on the market today. Yes, I am talking about Elmer T. Lee Single Barrel Bourbon. But as you have come to expect from some big goofy dude who calls himself the History Nerd, I am first going to give you the history not only of how this bourbon began, but about this jolly looking fellow for whom it is named. So without further ado, let's get started. So Elmer Tandy Lee was born in 1919 in Peeks Mill, Kentucky. He served on B-29 bombers in World War II, and after the war ended, he got a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Kentucky. Immediately upon graduation, he hightailed it for the George T. Stagg Distillery, where he used to work summers as a boy. And he asked the president of the distillery, Colonel Albert B. Blanton, for a job. Well, Blanton told him, "Sorry, son, we are not hiring right now. Go somewhere else." But another employee at the distillery named Orville Shoup suggested to Elmer Lee that he pull a George Costanza and show up for work the next Monday anyway. So that's what Elmer T. Lee did, and he never left. That's how one of the most legendary careers in bourbon history began. During the decades he worked at the George Stagg Distillery, which of course we know as Buffalo Trace today, Lee held virtually every job, worked his way up to plant manager, and eventually in the 1980s, he became the master distiller at the George T. Stagg Buffalo Trace Distillery. But at the time he became the master distiller in the 1980s, bourbon sales were at their lowest point in history. Folks in the 1980s, in the mid-80s if you remember, were drinking stuff like Bartles and James wine coolers, and they were drinking vodka. Anything brown, any brown liquor, Americans had no interest in it. So the owners of the distillery told Elmer T. Lee, "Look, you are our new master distiller. You got to figure out something to jumpstart bourbon sales, or ain't none of us gonna have a job." So Elmer put his thinking cap on, and he remembered that Colonel Blanton had told him that there were places in the distillery that made honey barrels of bourbon, magnificent tasting bourbon. And Colonel Blanton, when he was at the distillery, he had long since retired by this time in the 80s. He was actually dead by this time. Colonel Blanton would go and tap those barrels whenever he had a party, and he would serve the uncut, unfiltered bourbon straight from the barrel to his party guests. Well, Elmer T. Lee remembered that Colonel Blanton said Warehouse H made particularly good honey barrels. So he went and tapped several of those barrels, bottled them, and wrote on the label the precise location where the bourbon came from within the distillery. And that bourbon, because the idea came from Colonel Albert B. Blanton, became known as Blanton's Bourbon. And it was the first single barrel bourbon ever sold. Now, when it came on the market, Blanton's was slow selling in the US because it sold for $30 at a time when most bourbon sold for $10. But in the Japanese market, if you remember in the 1980s, the Japanese economy was very strong. And the Japanese were going crazy and paying crazy prices for rare cognacs and single malt scotches. So in Japan, where brown liquor, rare brown liquor was the rage, Blanton's took off. And we know today that Blanton's is one of the hardest to get and most highly allocated bourbons in the U.S. today. So shortly after Blanton's came to the market, Elmer T. Lee decided to retire. I think it was 1985 that he retired. And shortly after that, Buffalo Trace decided to honor Lee with Elmer T. Lee Single Barrel Bourbon that they named after him. Now, even though he was retired, Elmer T. Lee still came back to the distillery every week, and he personally sampled the barrels that were selected for Blanton's and Elmer T. Lee. Blanton's has always come from Warehouse H. Elmer always thought that the bourbon from warehouses I and K were better than the bourbon from H. So he wanted the bourbons used for Elmer T. Lee to come from warehouses I and K. He gave an interview shortly before his death, and he said that he would sample 8 to 10 barrels at a time, taking small sips from each, rinsing out his mouth after each sample, and spitting out each sample because he couldn't walk if he had swallowed all of the samples that he tried throughout the day. So he would try 8 to 10, take a break, try 8 to 10 more, until he had sampled about 25 barrels a day. He said that he and his tasting panel, he had a group that also tasted with him. He and his tasting panel, out of 25 barrels, would usually reject only about 3 barrels. And interestingly, any one person on the tasting panel could reject a barrel. It didn't take a majority vote. It just took one person to say they wanted to reject the bourbon. Elmer T. Lee is a 90 proof bourbon, sells for about $40 a bottle, which is kind of a joke because it's hard to get at $40 a bottle. I got mine at retail price. I've said before in these videos, I've never paid secondary prices for a bourbon. Part of the fun of me for hunting for these bourbons is not only finding them, but paying basic retail. So I paid $40 for my Elmer T. Lee, but it sells on the secondary market from $250 to as high as $300. And now I do want to say one thing. One of my favorite TV shows is the TV show Justified. And perhaps the greatest villain in the history of television was Boyd Crowder, a character on Justified, played by the inimitable Walton Goggins. Try saying that word 3 times fast. Inimitable, inimitable, inimitable. Folks, it ain't easy. It took me years of practice to learn how to do that. But Boyd Crowder on the TV show Justified began on the show as a lowly coal miner. Became a white supremacist and then became a drug kingpin, but he started as a lowly coal miner. And when he was a coal miner, he drank wild turkey. But as he became more successful and his criminal enterprise spread wider, Boyd Crowder ended up having Elmer T. Lee as his bourbon of choice. So now that we've gotten through all of that, I think now is the time to sample some Elmer T. Lee. I have a sealed bottle here, but I am lucky enough, I have an open bottle as well, and this is the one we're going to try. Now, this is the basic Elmer T. Lee. Elmer T. Lee died at the age of 93, but in 2019, on what would have been his 100th birthday, Buffalo Trace came out with a centennial edition of Elmer T. Lee, which simply can't be found for any price that's less than the gross domestic product of Rhode Island. So today what we're going to have is the basic Elmer T. Lee. When I've been over it, that reminded me, some of you may have noticed I have some new artwork here in the man cave. Mrs. History Nerd is completely underwhelmed by my artwork. She is not a connoisseur of the fine arts like I am, but Pablo Picasso painted this masterpiece during his Bandit period, and it is titled Diablo Sandwich and a Dr. Pepper. But I'm particularly proud of that beautiful piece of art. So now, with that said, let's pull the cork and pour us a sample of Elmer T. Lee and give it a taste. Well, we'll nose it first. We always nose a bourbon first. You know, I've said before, I thought people who said, I smell lilies and spring dew, and I smell cardamom in the background. I always thought they were full of crap. But y'all, if you stick your nose in the bourbon, inhale and really concentrate, you can pick up notes. And as I've said before, when you nose a bourbon and you inhale, you open your mouth so the ethanol goes in your nose and out your mouth. Otherwise, if you close your mouth and smell, you're just gonna get a big mouthful of alcohol. So, you know, y'all, it is a beautiful nose because you've got leather and tobacco. You've got, there's this wonderful antique must smell. That reminds me, have you ever opened a book, an antique book that has not been opened for like decades and got that whiff of the antique smell that comes out of the book? That's what I get from this. Now, Elmer T. Lee said that he insisted all of the bourbons used for Elmer T. Lee, all of the barrels, are aged at least 8 to 9 years. So this bourbon does have a little age on it. You know, you also got some fruit in here. You got some lemon peel. I can tell you that the caramel and the oak that you usually get from a bourbon are not real prominent. You got the leather and the tobacco, and you've got that dusty must old book smell that's so wonderful, but not a lot of oak. So now let's take a sip. The thing that is most obvious at first, it's a 90 proof bourbon, but it tastes like a much higher proof. It's not hot, it doesn't drink hot, but it tastes stouter than a 90 proof. I can tell you, even though we're not to the finish yet, you're getting a good chest hug from this. But you get some fruit on this. I got some apple and some fruit taste that it reminds me a little bit of Four Roses. The viscosity on this, folks, it's almost like drinking syrup. I mean, it just kind of dances down your throat. Part of the experience of bourbon is the nose, the taste, but it's the feel of it. There's nothing worse than a watery bourbon. Some young cardboard tasting bourbon is bad enough, but when it's just watery, that's terrible. This drinks like syrup, and it's wonderful. You don't get the caramel and the oak on the nose, but you get it on the taste. It's wonderful. And you know what it tastes like? Between the apple fruit and the caramel flavor, it tastes like a caramel apple at the state fair. I mean, it is delightful. And then here on the finish, I'm getting cinnamon and that oak, and you get just a little hug in your chest. It's not hot, but it's like somebody just kind of turned the oven up to simmer. I'm going to tell you, this is one of my favorite bourbons. And it's not just because it's hard to get. I'll be honest with you. I love all of Buffalo Trace's products. I'm a huge E.H. Taylor fan. But honestly, I think if I were on a deserted island and they said you can take one case of bourbon with you on the island, although it would be hot as hell on the island, you might not want to drink bourbon on a tropical island, but if I did, I think I would take Elmer T. Lee. Is it worth the chase? Is it worth the hunt? I think so. Is it worth $250 to $300 a bottle? That's up for you to decide. A bourbon is worth what you think it's worth, not what somebody else thinks it's worth. But it is wonderful. Now, let me point out something else. In that same interview I referenced earlier, shortly before his death, Elmer T. Lee said he did not like to drink his bourbon straight. He liked to drink Elmer T. Lee in a certain way, and that was over ice with Sprite. So I thought we would try an experiment, and we will pour the rest of our Elmer T. Lee in a cup. We will add some Sprite, and we will try to drink Elmer T. Lee the way that Elmer T. Lee drank it, and we will see how it tastes. Bottoms up, folks. Here's to Elmer T. Lee. So how does Elmer T. Lee's preferred way to drink Elmer T. Lee bourbon taste? It tastes like an effective way to fuck up the flavor of a perfectly good bourbon on its own. You have witnessed the first and only time I will drink Elmer T. Lee bourbon mixed with Sprite. So that's it, folks. That's the video. I'm a huge fan of Elmer T. Lee. If you can find it, buy it. At what price, that's up to you. Like I said, I always hunt till I find it for retail, but that's hard to do. I feel sometimes like Indiana Jones when I'm hunting for allocated bourbons at retail price. So that's the video, folks. Look, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like them, I need you to do 3 things for me. I need you to give me the Fonzie thumbs up, hit subscribe, and then ring the bell so the next time I fire up the old YouTube gizmo, you will be the first to know. I will close this video like I close all of my videos by encouraging each and every one of you viewers, and I am thankful for all of you. I encourage you to be good, be well, be happy, and goodbye, folks. We'll see you the next time we're back in History Nerds Man Cave. God bless. Take care.